Hello and welcome to Identerati Office Hours. I'm your host, Mike Schwartz, founder of Glue. And this week we have the topic is Authorization Renaissance. Why now? And the guest this week is David Broussard, CTO of Axiomatics, and Jerry Gable, VP of Product and Standards at Strata Identity. Welcome, David,
Hi, thanks, Mike. Hey,
and
everyone.
welcome,
Hey,
Jerry.
Jerry.
Hey, David. Hey, Michael.
So, David, I'm going to start with a question for you. I was worried that Identerati was too obscure of a name for this live stream, but I was doing the homework that you assigned on the wiki page, and I saw Alex and Tariq use the term authorati, and I'm wondering, is that really a thing?
It is. It is really a thing. It's a term that I think Sebastian from Umbrella Associates in Germany came up with last year at Identiverse. We created this little group called Authorati. I think we debated a little whether there should be a Z in there as well because of authorization, but the name kind of stuck, and it's a group of people who just love to talk about authorization.
And I think I'm going to pose this question to both you and Jerry, but do you agree with my contention that there has been a renaissance of authorization technologies? And if so, why do you think that's happening right now?
Jerry, you want to go first?
Well, yeah, sure, I can go first. It's definitely happening because if you just look around at the amount of investment that's occurring in the authorization space these days, it's tremendous. By last count of a couple months ago, I think there were something like 14 or 15 commercial vendors and products out there, plus what, 8, 9, or 10 or more open source projects. So there's an amazing amount of effort and resources being put to innovating in this area. So absolutely, there is a renaissance, I would say. Why? I mean, I think a lot of the pressures for or reasons for doing fine-grained authorization or externalized authorization have been in place for a long time. But I think that those pressures are just increasing. When you look at the manner and nature of security breaches that are happening, how everyone wants access to everything from any device. So you think about the policies and rules needed to implement something like that. So those reasons and more, I'm sure, David, you would say are some reasons for this renaissance.
Absolutely, definitely the fact that companies are now more mature with their identity management, their user management, their authentication. It gives them an opportunity to go and look at authorization. Like you said, Jerry, there is a whole new slew of vendors and open source frameworks that exist out there that people can look at and adopt. There's also the fact, I always go back to the fact there's a lot more data, a lot more sources, a lot more users that interact with one another online, and therefore there's more need for fine-grained authorization. You can see this like the digitization of everything, like medical records 5, 10 years ago were not digital, or 15 years ago were not digital. They are now. Maybe 5 years ago, only you could get access to the medical record, but now your insurance company can, your specialist doctor can, your next of kin can. All these are authorization use cases that need to be addressed. And then we're seeing also greater maturity in terms of what authorization models there are. So I can see at least 3 today. The policy-driven approach, the graph-based approach to authorization, and then the access control list approach, Zanzibar style. And it's quite cool to see all these models mature and pop up.
And the article that the ID Pro article you recommended actually was quite interesting in that it was describing a taxonomy. I guess at the point when you need to define a taxonomy for authorization, you really are approaching a lot of diversity in the technologies. But before maybe we pivot into the tech, let's stay on the business a little bit. What do you? Sometimes I feel like in technology we think of these great solutions, but there aren't necessarily the business drivers that motivate companies to actually acquire these new technologies. What do you think are some of the actual like business requirements that companies are saying, I have this problem, and if I do authorization, I can ship more product, or so where's the business value driving this? Or is it just a technology people now realize it's technically possible and they're building product?
I'll take a stab, Jerry, and correct me as I go along. I'll say there's two camps. The first camp is people who realize that they can be more efficient by adopting externalized authorization, right? Much like as a developer, you would never dream of implementing authentication. You want to reuse authentication. You want to have a library that'll handle the OAuth flows for you and the OpenID Connect flows for you. You want to do the same thing with authorization. So that's camp number one. I would argue that today it's probably the smaller camp in externalized authorization, but growing fast thanks to a lot of new developer focused startups. The other camp is the camp that needs to prove compliance, that needs to implement things like export control or anti-money laundering legislation. That's the main business driver that we've seen up to now for externalized authorization. And it's not so much the externalization, but it's just the ability to show that you are implementing that piece of legislation, that you are compliant with XYZ, and that you can take a policy or an artifact and go to the compliance team and say, hey, this is what I'm doing. And also get an audit trail of what access was granted or denied so that you can prove you're in compliance with these different pieces of legislations.
Yeah, in addition to that, I would say there's value in data, there's value in business processes, and there's how do you realize that data? By sharing that information, that data, that process with whether it's different groups within your organization across different lines of business, or of course with outside parties, with your customers, your supply chain, other partners. And how do you do that securely and in compliance and in a privacy aware way? I mean, that's difficult to do. It's hard to factor in all of that logic into an application directly when you have all of these potentially robust services and products available, so you can outsource that from the logic of the app and really make your data more easily shared. So I think of it more as an enablement layer rather than just, this is the security department, this is the department of no, or compliance, has to be done this way. I think about making the right way or the most secure way, also the easiest way, the easiest path forward is something that we should strive for.
It's been interesting to see the development of Styra and OPA over the last couple of years. And it reminds me sometimes that a segmented marketing approach can be really effective, because they didn't try and solve authorization for everything, although really they could, right? Because it's a pretty generic authorization framework. But it seems like the application they focus on was Kubernetes access control, and they achieved a lot of success in that one segment. I should say they achieved a lot of adoption. I don't know if that's converted into commercial success or not, but I know I see from my perspective that they've achieved a lot of adoptions. Are there any lessons there for how perhaps to gain adoption, we should maybe focus on segmented business value versus of authorization versus sort of general purpose?
I think that this is a two-sided question because I could answer as a standards person. I could also answer as a vendor, right? As a vendor, you're probably always better off identifying a beachhead, a very specific segment that you want to go after, say export control, and then build a product that is very focused on that, very repeatable. And then you go sell to all the export control regulated industries. And yeah, you might have an authorization language inside of your product that delivers the fine-grained authorization for export control. You might also actually have built some kind of authentication that might be specific to export control. So generally speaking, as a business, yeah, you probably want to be extremely focused because you're repeatable, you're more relevant. As a standards person, like the lesson learned from Open Policy Agent, there's a couple. First of all, they did their homework. A lot of people who come up with new standards, they do not look at what exists. In the case of Open Policy Agent and the founders of Styra, they actually looked at XACML, they looked at ALFA, they looked at the existing standards back when they started in 2015 or so. And in their case, they concluded that the languages were not flexible enough. And that's why they came up with Rego, which is a programming language. You can pretty much do anything under the sun. Now, As for adoption, I think the fact that they're open source, the fact that they have a free engine that anyone can consume, that makes the adoption much easier. If you compare it with Xacml, which also has open source engines, of course, Xacml, because it was born in 2001, it probably did not adapt quickly enough to the changes like moving to JSON, moving to YAML, that of course Open Policy Agent did from the get-go because they were in that world already. Having focused, the last thing I'll add is they also focused on a specific developer need they saw in the Kubernetes world, right? In the infrastructure world. Xacml, on the other hand, it was born out of Oasis. It was born out of the fact that, oh, we're doing federation work, we're doing SAML, we're doing all these standards. Well, if we're doing SAML and federation and identity management, well, we probably need something about access control. So it kind of was born out of not quite a vacuum, but almost a vacuum, if you will, not tied directly to developer pain, and therefore that could also explain the speed with which it was adopted compared with the speed with which Open Policy Agent was adopted.
Jerry, any thoughts or just observations about Styra and OPA?
Yeah, I think one of the main reasons why we're talking about this renaissance around authorization is due to Open Policy Agent and just the level of awareness that they have brought to the market, that this is a distinct identity and access management capability, and that it should be, treated separately than, than your application, right? And applying it to, yes, the Kubernetes world, but also APIs and so on. So I think just the level of awareness they brought to the market about authorization, I think is super significant.
Yeah, and to be honest, I kind of had that feeling too, that if you take OPA out of this, I'm not sure that we have this renaissance. And I wonder if the lessons that people got out of OPA apply to the next markets that they'll be applying it to, and I guess we'll see from there.
I think it would still have a renaissance. It might not be as big, but you also had Zanzibar that fueled the renaissance when Google came out with their access control model, kind of highlighting the need for authorization. You have startups like Signal, more focused on event-driven authorization. That also fuels the renaissance. And I mentioned Signal because they're ex-Googlers, so they also come from the Zanzibar background. And you also have like the traditional large identity management vendors like Ping, like Okta, who are now looking at the next wave of innovation. And in the case of Okta, they're investing in something called OpenFGA. So they are also fueling that renaissance of authorization.
David, in your talk at the Nordic API Summit in Austin back in March, you posited that authorization should be declarative, dynamic, and decoupled.
Yes.
Can you expand on that a little?
Sure. So decoupled simply because you want to write an app, a service, or you want to host a piece of data, and you want to have the authorization decoupled from that service so that it can evolve independently. If, for instance, you built a bank account API, the legislation or the need to share that bank account with different individuals might evolve independently of how you handle the bank account. So you want to be able to evolve the two pieces independently one another. The first point you said was decorative. I think that if you want to audit and review and test your authorization, it makes sense to have it as a decorative document that you can look at and understand. So in my mind, I'm thinking in policy, of course, I'm biased towards that model, but it makes it easier to say you write your API and then you write your authorization configuration, the policy, and then you go to your compliance team or your application owner team and you say, hey, here's the policy I wrote. Here's what it does. That I think is extremely compelling because anyone, assuming the policy language is simple enough to read, which it should, anyone can understand what the policy does. And what was the middle point? I forgot the middle point.
Dynamic, declarative.
Oh, dynamic, of course.
Dynamic and decoupled, yeah.
Yeah, so dynamic is a given. In the world that we live in today, we can't just have static entitlements anymore. It might very well be that you want to use dynamic attributes like time of day. It might well be that the entitlements that you have are very short-lived. So maybe you have a clearance, you're top secret, but you're only top secret for 5 minutes. Or maybe your device data will determine what access you should be getting to. So I'm going to sound very marketing-like. In a zero-trust world, you want to have fresh information based on which you want to make decisions. And the interesting thing is, if you look at the work being done in the OAuth community right now around transaction tokens and rich authorization requests, they're also trying to move towards a more dynamic world. Although they're doing it in an identity-centric way based on tokens, but they're still seeing that need for dynamic authorization.
Yeah,
Well,
I heard.
if I could jump in,
Sorry,
Mike.
Jerry, go ahead. Yeah, please.
Yeah, David triggered me with one of these terms, zero trust. So,
Uh-oh.
but I want to focus on the word zero, and zero standing privilege seems to be a trend that's evolved fairly recently. Can you talk about what that is and what you think about that as an approach to authorization or access control?
Is that a question for Mike or for me, Jerry?
For you, of course. You're the interrogatee here.
Was that a question that came from Mark?
No, it did not.
No? Okay. Well, I think we all know the story that when you enter in a relationship, either as an employee with a company or maybe even as a consumer with a vendor, you're going to be given some rights. And those are what traditionally we call birthrights or initial entitlements, right? And oftentimes it's a one-off thing. There's very little governance on those permissions or entitlements. So what happens is over time, as your career spans, 1 year, 5 years, 10 years at a given company, you're going to be accumulating rights. And that's a big, big risk because you're going to end up having more permissions than you should. And let's assume you're not a disgruntled employee, you're not a malicious employee. It's okay because you're not going to abuse those permissions, although it's still not okay because you shouldn't have them. But what if you get hacked, or what if you become disgruntled? Suddenly, there's a whole lot of damage that you can do. And depending on how the access is enforced, people might not even realize that you're doing it. So the whole idea of least privilege, principle of least privilege or zero standing privilege, is that you're not going to be given any entitlements. You're not going to be given any rights. Rather, as you try to do something there and then, we're going to check, oh, can you do this? Right? Can you view medical record XYZ? And that's the promise and the beauty of ABAC or fine grained authorization, as put forward by NIST in their ABAC paper, as put forward by one of the design patterns that we're defining within the Authz working group at OpenID. It'll solve, by the way. Sorry, Mike and Jerry, just to add, it'll solve a whole lot of things like privilege account management because it won't be as critical. It won't entirely solve it because you always need keys for like super admin accounts. But let's assume that everything was done through zero standing privilege, then we would potentially have fewer attacks, or at least attacks that are not as damaging because they would very quickly stop at the next gate, at the next door.
That sounds somewhat aspirational to me. And actually, Ian Glazer is going to be talking about zero standing privilege on 425. So save your questions on zero standing privilege and you can put them in from the audience. But yeah, I think to me, it seems like it's aspirational. And I just wanted to make one point about, because I heard you say this also in your talk at the Nordic API Summit about tokens, OAuth tokens. I see them as input to policy, just like here's the time of day, here's the IP address, and here's the token. And the policy looks at those tokens and then decides if access should be granted or not. But I don't really see any overlap here because the token is just a way that some central authority can sign an assertion that can be used as input to policy, but it was never designed or meant to be a replacement for policy management. So
it is. I agree. I couldn't agree more. And definitely in a clean, proper theoretical architecture, it is what you just said, where the token is input to the policy. And as a matter of fact, it's a great input because in traditional ABAC, you rely on what's known as a PIP, a policy information point, to go fetch data about the user or about the resource. And of course, if you have the user data coming in as a token, then it's going to make the system more performant. But what's happening though in API land is that they have to authenticate the API. So they have to do OAuth or some other mechanism, but generally OAuth, perhaps OpenID Connect. So they already end up with an access token. They already end up maybe with an enriched token with additional data inside. And what's going to happen is the API code or the application code behind the API, when it sees that token, instead of going off to a PDP and saying, hey, can I do this? Or can the user do that? Or can this user identified by this token do that? They're going to look at the claims and the scopes inside of the token and then hard code authorization logic within the app based on those claims and those scopes. The example that I gave at the Nordic APIs talk was an integration between FileStack and Google Drive, where I was trying to upload a Google Drive doc from my Google Drive to SlideShare without downloading it on my computer and uploading it. And then the way the OAuth integration had been done between FileStack and Google Drive was it was an all or nothing. Either I was giving FileStack access to all my Google Drive, or I just did not connect. And that is a poor use of authorization. And that's just because they were looking at the scope, view files, instead of having a finer grained decision as dictated by a policy.
I think I was laughing because I was like, don't throw the IDPs under the bus here. It's really the API gateway vendors are the one to blame because they're not using the PDP. But perhaps maybe to look deeper at why not. Maybe because if there was standards around how to query an authorization provider, we might see more adoption from API gateways. Can you talk a little bit about that and perhaps maybe the OpenID AuthZen standard that's been proposed?
Yeah, I absolutely. I wouldn't throw the API gateway vendors under the bus either. I think it's more the API developers that are, trying to go for the fastest, cheapest route. And the fastest, cheapest route is to buy the least amount of, when I say buy, it doesn't have to be buy a vendor product, but it's just use the least amount of dependency. So when you build an API, what's the minimum stuff you need? Well, you need authentication. So you're going to have to do OAuth. That's a given. And if you want to be fancy and more secure and cleaner, you need an API gateway. And then authorization, it would really be nice to have it, but you know what? I can do it in code. I think that's the mentality that we have to fight. The fact that developers are still thinking, oh, it's yet another piece. Let me just do it in my code. It's just a few if statements. But to go back to your question, as of, I think, 2 years ago, a group of people got together at Identerati to create a new working group. I think it was called Policy Charter back in the day. Jerry, you were one of the founding members.
That's right.
And we met again a year later, Identerati 2023. And I call it the Wednesday meeting. It makes it sound like a Addams Family thing, but it was just on a Wednesday. And from there, we actually started working. We changed the name from Policy Charter to AuthZen. And we have 3 main goals within AuthZen. It's a working group within OpenID. Goal number 1 is to standardize the PEP PDP interface. Now, when you look at standards that existed before, XACML was really the only one that defined a proper interface. Open Policy Agent, in good old Open Policy Agent style, they let you do whatever you wanted to do. So you could just create your own interface. And that was good enough. It was extremely flexible. Cedar, because it's a library, didn't really have an interface to speak of, at least not at a service level. And other standards were vendor specific. So AuthZen said, okay, let's all align. And we looked at Topaz and Acerto and Axiomatics and Cedar and AWS and 3 Edges. And we kind of try to find common ground to build a new interface that everyone would adopt so that you could send an authorization request from a PEP, from an API gateway, for instance, to a PDP. At the same time, we defined the use cases. What are the use cases for querying authorization? And right now we've landed on 3. The first one is, can a user do this? Yes or no. That's the binary yes, no authorization request. Very classic. The second one is the same, but in a batch mode. So you say, can user X do this and that and that and that and that and that? And you get as many decisions back as you had questions. And the third interface we're standardizing is what we call search right now within AuthZen, what others have called partial evaluation or reverse query. It's the ability to say, oh, I know I'm dealing with Alice. What can she do? Or I know I'm dealing with bank account 123. Who can get access to bank account 123 under what circumstances? So that's the search API in AuthZen terminology. So at Identerati 2024, in a month or so, we're going to be doing an interop of the first endpoint, the binary yes/no single request, and from beyond that, we're going to add on the other 2 interfaces, and then hopefully get interops as well around that.
Jerry, any thoughts you want to add on that? I didn't know you were involved in that, but And
He's my chaperone
how's it
everywhere.
evolved since the original idea?
Yeah, it was really Alan Foster and I think who were the main instigators. Trying to get together a group of like-minded folks around authorization a couple years ago, like David mentioned, and then it seemed like we had some conversations over email, and it fizzled out pretty quickly after that Identiverse. And then last year, we just saw a lot more attention within the conference, on the agenda, a lot of different speakers talking about the rise of authorization and its importance. And we saw that at other conferences as well, the Gartner Identity Conference and the European Identity Conference and so on. So I think last year, David, it was just seemed like it was a better time for people. There were more people more seriously focused on this topic area, and they wanted to try to do something about interoperability because David has mentioned a bunch of different implementations, whether it's standard based or open source or other, and there is so much overlap, but there's very little to no interoperability. Even one open policy agent implementation doesn't necessarily interoperate with another. And back in the day, we did some interoperability demos for XACML, for example, within constrained use cases. But there is no generic or no general interoperability across implementations. And that's really what we're focused on at this point. And hopefully that will encourage more adoption of this capability. And I think that's also one of the initiatives or one of the goals of the AuthZen group is to just to describe different authorization models and implementations and, give some recommendations on, what better practices might be.
In the old days, we used to talk about PDP, PEP, PIP, PAP. Are those still do they still exist?
Well, some would say yes. Some would debate these topics. I tease David a little bit and say there's no such thing as a policy enforcement point anymore. And I say that because, even in the XACML model, any application, any system, any programming language that can construct a JSON message in a certain format
Mm-hmm.
and post it to an HTTP endpoint, and then, read the response back, the JSON response. Well, what do I need a PEP for if I could just do that in my code? And David argues for something else, but I also think that's an indication of the maturity level of this marketplace and the capabilities, that you don't need this heavyweight SDK, from back in the day to marshal XML and handle the SOAP exchange and so on. So it's so much more lightweight today than it ever was in the past. And I think that's what I'm trying to emphasize when I say, hey, we don't need a PEP anymore.
Yeah, I think on an abstract level, the architecture is still there, right? But it's evolved so much. Back in 2010, when Jerry and I worked together, we were spring chicken, or at least I was a spring chicken.
Thanks, David.
You're very welcome, Jerry. We would say you have the one central PDP to rule them all within the enterprise, and of course, it did work, and that was fine back in the day, I guess. But it's not the only model. And Open Policy Agent helped us see the light in a way, because they started talking about authorization for Kubernetes, for infrastructure, for microservices, and of course, one central PDP does not work anymore in that world, because the latency would be too high, the performance would be too low. And so now we're talking about a sidecar PDP. Does that go against the ABAC architecture of PAP PDP? No, absolutely not. The architecture is flexible enough to address that. If you want to embed a PDP in an app, you can. If you want to have a sidecar, you can. If you want a central PDP, you can. You can mix and match. And I think that's true of pretty much any vendor, right? It's not necessarily that the vendor this does that or vendor that does that. I think it's just a benefit of the architecture. Much like the PEP, in theory, the PEP is still there, right? But of course, like Jerry says, they're no longer XML gateways, data power style from 15 years ago. They could be your app. They could be a one-liner. They could be a bit of JSON code. They could be JavaScript. They've become so much smaller and lighter. Again, the microservices world has taught us so much with ingress gateways that don't necessarily look at the entire payload of what's going through, but maybe just the headers, which in turn makes for lighter PEPs, maybe not as smart because they don't see the payload, but maybe they just see the right level of information that you need to do for authorization decisions. So a lot of new patterns. One more thing though I'll add, you can tell me to be quiet too, is that there is this friendly clash between the OAuth world in terms of resource server, authorization server, relying party, client architecture, and the P star P architecture. And Eve Mailer had a really, really good session at IW back in October. She called it the P star P v AS RS Smackdown. And we're working on an authorization panel at Identiverse, details to be announced. And we're probably going to be talking about those two different patterns and how they can be combined together. Because to your point, Mike, you can consume tokens in policy, you can consume tokens in authorization graphs, so they're not incompatible.
Yeah, and the idea though that we have, let's say, multiple PDPs in a microservices architecture running as a sidecar is not necessarily, as long as they're all still managed centrally, the fact that we've distributed them out for performance doesn't mean that there's multiple PDPs.
No, and that's also something else that I think we've evolved over the years. Back in 2010, I would have said one central PDP, one central management, one central policy. And the truth is, yes, you can have that if that's what the enterprise calls for, but you also want to have potentially different policies depending on the application you want to protect. So maybe instead of selling one central PDP, what you're selling to the enterprise is an authorization capability that application teams can adopt at their own pace and use in their own way with their own policies. And then you enter the whole realm of collaboration, authorization collaboration. What that means is maybe you're a large Fortune 500 company, you've let the different application owners write their own policies because they know best about their business. That being said, you also know you need to comply with AML or export control or HIPAA. And so you're going to write those global policies that will enforce that piece of legislation, and you will give them to those app owners who don't understand AML, who do not understand these pieces of legislation, and they can reference those in their own policies to make sure they're compliant. So it opens up a whole new ability to work where app owners, they're going to do their own policies. They understand them really well. Great. They will take central policies from a central team that have to find those central policies so that they're compliant with X, Y, and Z.
One challenge that I think a distributed PDP architecture brings out is, where does the information come from? When we had one PDP, we could pull from a database. But now that we have lots of PDPs in microservices, how do we get, I feel like there's two approaches here. One, we send it all the information in the request, or two, we end up caching the information in the PDP itself. Can you maybe talk about some of the strategies around getting, what happens to the PIP, the policy information point, now that the PDP has been decentralized?
Yeah, before you answer, David, I think this is a really interesting aspect of the market and some of the innovation we talked about at the top, because there are a lot of different philosophies around this question that Mike is asking, and so many different approaches to it. So go ahead.
And Jerry, I'll echo what you just said. I think at a high level, there's two camps, at least in the authorization vendors and frameworks that I see. Excuse me, there are two camps. There's the camp that will suck in all the information they need upfront. I'm thinking of OpenFGA, that's their model. They'll suck in all the information. That'll give them the schema as well. And if they have a schema, they have a good understanding of what policies they can model. And then because all the data is there, their decision-making is going to be instant. Now, the drawback of that approach, of course, is that you have to keep syncing the data from the different sources into your own internal database. And so you might have stale data, so on and so forth. But that's approach number one. Approach number two is, let's go fetch the data from wherever it belongs. So that's the traditional ABAC PIP approach. That's what the likes of Axiomatics and others do. And then in that model, there's two subdivisions. One is the PDP will fetch the data as it needs to, or the PEP could have provided the data. So earlier, when you said that we could use an identity token as a source of attributes, that's an example of the PEP providing the token to the PDP so that the PDP does not have to go to LDAP or AD or Entra to figure out the user data. When you do use a PIP, it's common sense to do caching as well. And of course, if you do caching, you have to think about how often it's refreshed and then how long it lives for and how big the cache is. And if you have multiple PDPs within the infrastructure, is the cache distributed? And also, if you have multiple PDPs, do all PDPs need to connect to all data sources? Not necessarily. In a big bank, if you have a retail bank application, that retail bank app probably doesn't need a PDP that can talk to wealth management PIPs because they're not the same realm, right? So you could also think about which PIPs are connected to which PDPs. But these are the two camps. Now, I think there's also the work that a tool has been doing, a tool from Signal. I'm not going to try to pronounce his last name.
That's all. It's fine. Yeah.
Yeah,
We know what
Atul's
you're talking about. The director,
exactly.
the new director of the OIDF, Atul from Signal. Yes.
There we go. And he has been working on a standard called CAPE, C-A-E-P, which is essentially event processing standard. And under the guise of OpenID Foundation, the working group is called Shared Signals, if I'm not mistaken. And the whole idea is that in a world where you're doing token-based authorization, in a world where you have sessions that are relatively long-lived, as opposed to a PET PDP approach where you decide right there and then, how about we send signals from an attribute source, a data source, to say, oh, that user's risk score has changed, or that user's device or posture has changed, sending a signal to whoever holds a session about that user to terminate the session, or maybe augment the token that goes along with the session to enrich the token with additional data. So that's another way to address the data conversation.
Yeah, that's a topic deserving a whole 45 minutes. And in my quick view on that is that a lot of identity has been synchronous. We send a request and we get a response, but a lot of identity events are actually asynchronous. Logout is your poster child for this. We have a logout event. We need to notify all of the RPs, and some of that we might need to resend some of those messages if they fail. And assurance level rise, I log in with password, but then I use passkeys. So I need to tell the RPs that this session is now better authenticated. So I feel like CAPE is more about conveying or providing a pub sub infrastructure for some of these asynchronous, for some of these challenges that are better modeled in an asynchronous manner. But I would say
Yeah.
you still need a PDP to react to those. Okay, so now we know that there's been an account breach at another RP. That probably, we want to send that to our pal, or maybe we get some other piece of contextual information through the pub sub infrastructure. Maybe
Yeah.
we need to reevaluate policies. So I still see CAPE as really adjacent to, and not a replacement for the policy infrastructure.
It's
But
not. Sorry, go
yeah,
ahead.
I
It's
wanted to pivot into one area which I see is that when you gave your example for Authz, you were talking about the interface being, can a person do this? But what we're seeing is a lot of the authorization questions are, can a system do this? Or can a system do this on behalf of a person? And I feel like there's sometimes people don't understand how important it is that we authenticate the software that's acting on our behalf or software that's acting autonomously. Will Authz also address some of these use cases in the machine to machine or software to software use cases?
The short answer is yes. And my belief is that there really isn't anything in Authz or in Cedar or in ALFA or in XACML or in OPA that precludes those use cases. Because at the end of the day, what you have is a policy language, and you can make the policy do whatever you want it to do. And then you have a set of attributes that could describe anything you want to describe. And then you send a question. So could you create an attribute called end user identity? And then could you create an attribute called machine identity or acting on behalf of identity and send those in as input to drive the down to specific policy? Yes, you can. Totally. Absolutely. So when I say, my example on Authz was, can Alice view account one? That works. Can system one view account one on behalf of Alice? That also works. There's nothing technically that prevents that second question from happening. And there is a working group at IETF, if I'm not mistaken, called WIMSI, Workload Identity, and I forgot what MSC stands for. and multi-system environments, maybe. And Peter would kill me for not knowing the acronym. We can totally use the Authz interface. There's nothing that precludes the standard from being used in those use cases. And definitely machine identity is going to be the next big thing.
Yeah,
Jerry, do you see any challenges in this area?
Well, I think, Whimsy is a new working group at IETF, if I remember correctly. Yep. And I think we're just typically in the habit of talking about user scenarios. Alice can do this, Bob can do that. But for forever, I mean, system identities have been part of the model here. It's just not what we generally describe as use case.
Okay, well, we are getting to the end of the episode, and put on my. But before we actually end, I wanted to make a quick pitch for Internet Identity Workshop, and we have a discount code from Phil Windley. He'll be a guest in an upcoming Identerati Office Hours episode. So it's authz _38_20. That's 38 in Roman numerals. So David, will you be attending IAW?
Not in April, no. I'm hoping to make it in October, but not this April, unfortunately.
Okay. Yeah, and
but
Jerry mentioned before he's not going to be able to make it, but yeah, go ahead.
There is an authorization happy hour happening on the Thursday evening, if I recall correctly. So be on the lookout for details in the authorization newsletter that we've been sending out. I can actually mention the URL. So if you go to authz.substack.com, this is where we maintain an authorization newsletter. We being a group of folks from the industry, so it is not vendor specific. And there is information there about we're going to do an Authz get together and then an authorization happy hour on the Thursday afternoon.
Yeah, David and I were both at IAW last October, and there were a load of authorization sessions there. It was really great discussions. I won't be there this month either, but hope to be there on a regular basis going forward.
And I will be there. I'm a regular unless I'm traveling. I normally show up. But yeah, I expect there'll be a lot of authorization sessions this time too. And a lot of decentralized identity talk if you're interested in that topic. And even some interesting things happening in OAuth and OpenID land. So believe it or not, there's still innovation in OAuth and OpenID. For example, we have transaction tokens, as David mentioned, which is really the flip side of rich authorization requests. So a rich authorization request is a more detailed request for access, and the transaction token is what you get in response to that rich authorization request. And one of the nice things about a token like that is that you have the details of the authentication event. So the IDP authenticates that client before it issues that token. So, and also the token can be enriched with other information outside of what was in the request itself. So that's a really interesting topic. CAPE, as you mentioned, also is happening. And there's a really interesting new standard called OAuth First Party Native Authentication. This was proposed by Aaron Parecki, Peter Kasselman, and one other person I'm forgetting. This is a code flow, a back-channel code flow.
Is it George Dobbs?
It might be. Maybe it's George Fletcher, actually.
Fletcher?
Let me look it up right now. But this is a really interesting new.
Yeah,
George Fletcher.
Yeah. Sorry.
Sorry, George. So this is a really interesting new standard because a lot of customers want to authenticate users without the redirect to the login page. And previously, this wasn't really possible in OAuth. People were hacking the resource owner password credential grant. But this new standard called OAuth First Party Native Authentication, and it's got to be first party because if it's third party, they'd see the password. But if it's a first party app, maybe it's okay if you see the password. So there's still a lot happening in OAuth land. Atul also has, I believe, is also co-author of the dynamic client registration with attestation. So there's really a lot still happening and a lot of work to be done in OAuth land, in authorization land, and a lot of those discussions happen at IAW. So if you can join us, please join us. And David and Jerry, thank you so much for joining us today. It was a great conversation. And
Thanks.
feel free to join. You're now Identerati Office Hours alumni, which means you can back channel me if you ever want to join another one. And as long as Anish is there, our producer, he might be able to add you in dynamically into the conversation. So congratulations on being alumni. And thank you again for joining.
Thanks, Mike. See you,
Thanks.
David. Good to see you again.
All right. Bye.
And thanks to the audience for joining us today. And please comment if you
Hi,
have any
Matt.
questions.